Well, that wasn't supposed to happen. Hi, I'm Kent. This video was going to be about making a new plaster mold. Instead, it's going to be about my plaster disaster. I was planning on talking about a new mold that I'm in the process of making, and I got about halfway through, and things went a little sideways. As you can tell by my bench, I had a bit of a leak. Over here, I had, I don't know, maybe a good 2 inches of leak, and it spread across my bench. It managed to get onto my shaker table. My bucket here, this is actually by plan. I'll talk about that in a minute. Managed to get my drill, and it managed to get me. It all came down this way. And I was standing about here, and it got all over the floor and my mat. Not to mention me. It looks like my bench and my floor are going to get a long overdue cleaning. Along the way, I want to go and investigate exactly what went wrong. I have some ideas, but I think it'll be good to tear things apart and to reflect on that. So maybe what was expected. So when I'm mixing up my plaster, for a while I was putting in trash bags, and I saw that as a good way to go and clean up the plaster. The problem is my mixing paddle would often tear through the edge of the bag, and I wind up with plaster in the bucket anyways. What I realized is that these plastic tubs are thin enough that it's actually relatively easy just to break out the plaster. So I can deflect the bucket, and the plaster just breaks off the sides, and on the bottom, normally I do this over the trash, but obviously my bench is a bit of a trash zone right now. It just pops right out. So this takes just a few minutes to clean up, so it really isn't that bad. If you have a thin-walled bucket that you're mixing your plaster in, I've settled on this approach. At least one of the advantages is my kiln just finished a bisque firing, so it's warm in here. So when the leak happened, I went and dealt with the emergency, basically all the plaster over me. Got the hose and hosed myself down. The rest of this I decided was a problem for a future self. Well, that future self is me right now. So I have no idea what the best way to remove plaster from, say, a drill is. I suspect the answer is just to chip it off. All right, that's coming up pretty well. And the other annoying one is going to be my shaker table here. So this I got to help shake the bubbles out of the plaster. It was used, I got it in an auction. A few videos ago I showed that. The plaster spilled over the top, and I wiped off some of it, but there's definitely more on it. I'm not too sure if it would have been easier to clean up all this plaster while it was still curing. However, I was not in the mood, so we're dealing with it when it's dry. Sometimes the right answer is just to walk away and come back to it later. There's definitely plaster underneath this top plate here, so I'm going to have to figure out how to get that off. It's got these little retaining clips. I got those off, and I think this will just lift off. Indeed it does. Oh good, I even got plaster down inside. Isn't that special? However, it looks like just a little bit, so I think I'm okay. The other thing I think I'm gonna do is get a Scotch-Brite pad and see if I can scrub some of this stuff. If this were a new piece of equipment, I would probably be a little bit more miffed, but since it is old and only going to be used for plaster, I luckily am not too worried. And that's coming off pretty well. So that side. All right, this is in pretty good shape. To clean it up more, it's going to need a clean surface, and I don't have that right now. Let's do the top surface plate here. Turns out these look like they're actually bearings. So it's possible I may have gotten plaster in some of these and they might not be too happy. But I can replace those if I need to. All right, again, off to the side. All right, so those are the important things. I will need to chip everything off my bench. Let's turn to my mold next. What exactly went wrong? Well, there's a few things. One, this is the largest plaster pour I have ever done. It was about 5 kilograms of dry plaster. I've had leaks before, but they've all been relatively small. Nothing quite like this. So I was pushing my limits in general in terms of my skills, which is good. That's how you learn. The best way to learn is to try and do something just slightly outside of your comfort zone. If it's too far outside of your comfort zone, you'll just fail and you won't actually make any progress. If it's a little bit outside of your comfort zone, you can actually gradually increment and build your skills. That's what I was doing, so this mold is slightly bigger. The other thing I did was I used these 3D printed parts. As I was designing this new mold, which I'll talk about in a future video, I went through a couple of different iterations, and the first iteration I had these 3D printed parts on the outside that I was actually going to use to capture silicone. I didn't wind up going that way in the end. I figured it'd be nice to have a round wear board to contain the plaster. That mostly worked. I used my foil tape to secure the edges. This is actually 2 pieces. There's the red and the white piece, so they come apart. Where it failed was in the bottom. So the very bottom here is a piece of press board, and I have made molds on top of this before, and it's worked okay. However, it's very thin and very flexible. I also sealed the edge between the 3D printed piece and the wear board with some clay. Again, I've had success doing that before. This time I just did it on the outside. I didn't put any on the inside. I was trying to get the plaster to be in better shape. However, that may have been a failure. I also went ahead and put mold release on the wear board before I put on the clay. So that may have given a path for the clay not to stick and the plaster to get out. And then finally, these 3D printed pieces are actually warped a little bit. As I was printing them and taping them together, they were a little bit off, so it's possible there's just not as good a seal against the bottom as I needed. So in general, making sure my wear boards, in this case the 3D printed ones, are well sealed against the bottom, very critical. Plaster will often find a way. The last bit was, I was a little bit tired. I am actually recovering from a bit of a cold, and I was pushing myself probably a little bit too hard. I wanted to get this done. I knew it was actually going to be firing my kiln. It was going to be nice and warm in here, so the plaster would cure faster and dry out. That would let me get to using it faster. In retrospect, I probably should have waited till I was actually 100%. Luckily, I'm feeling much better now. That's a lesson I've learned about me. Unfortunately, you need to keep relearning it. Let's see if I can remove this from my bench, and we'll check out the mold. I know it's a failure. It was actually supposed to be filled all the way to the top, and this is actually part of the silicone underneath, so I don't think it's thick enough. So I think the right thing to do is just to pry it up. Oh, okay, well, there we go. That took some of the plaster with it. Got a paper towel embedded in the plaster. That was my attempt at making a dam. So that's how big my leak was. It was, yeah, a good solid inch. So this is trash. Oh, the wear board came off. It didn't stick, that's good. Yeah, it looks like the plaster came out this side, so this side just wasn't seated very well against the bottom. And then there's my poor bench. So this is a piece of plywood that I got when I started doing pottery for the first time. It's actually sitting on top of a bench that my grandfather made for me. At this point, it's a little bit wobbly because it's, I don't know, what, 40 years old almost. It could probably do with some reinforcement. I wanted the plywood on top to be able to absorb the moisture. The bench itself is finished. However, at this point, I'm not too sure if I'm going to be able to get the plaster off. Oh, maybe I'm in luck. That's awesome. All right. Maybe my bench is in good shape after all. All right, I'll go ahead and scrape that up off camera. You don't need to see that. And then the last thing I'll need to do is get all the plaster off the floor. I'll drag out my mat, hose it down, and then that'll give me a good opportunity to go ahead and mop and get all the dust anyways. I probably don't do that as often as I should. So while this was a plaster disaster, there might be a little bit of a silver lining. I'm not getting the mold I want, at least this time. But as I said, the best way to learn is by pushing myself just by a little bit. I may one day get to the point where I've leveled up my skills enough that I stop pushing and stop trying new things. I doubt it though. I think very fundamental to who I am is actually trying out new things. As I mentioned a few times on this channel, my background is actually in research, so I have a PhD in computer science. And one of the fundamental aspects of getting a PhD is pushing the boundary of knowledge for humanity. It's not just learning something new for yourself or, say, for your company. It's actually pushing the knowledge so that you actually learn something new about the world that no one else knew before. Clearly, I'm not doing that here for Pottery. I really am just trying to improve my own skills. But there are a lot of things I learned along the way that are, I think, innate in how I approach the world now. So one is learning about what's been done before. And luckily today, that's relatively easy to see. People are really open in sharing their processes and making their things on YouTube and Instagram and other places. That's great. I've been able to watch people that know how to do this better than I and acquire some skills. And hopefully some of you are doing the same with me. Maybe you are a couple steps behind and you can see what I'm doing and learn from both my mistakes and my successes. So there's this idea in science of standing on the shoulders of giants. Basically, all the people that have come before you that have done all these magical things, you're really just moving the field forward just a little bit. I'm not moving the field forward, but I am definitely standing on the shoulders of giants and all the people that have come before me doing these types of things. One of the other key skills that I have learned along the way is learning how to learn. So one of my skills is being able to jump into a relatively new domain, figure out what has been done, and leverage that. So I think there's some of that in my own pottery, but the other part is actually experimentation. You build up some idea of how the world works and want to try it out and see if that is correct or not. So as you've seen on my channel, I have a very kind of experimental approach to my pottery. This is me figuring out how to do it and actually trying to understand why certain things work. There's a lot of advice that's passed around through all of life, actually, but pottery is no different, that say people should do things one way or another. But there's very little consideration about why that should be done. Again, my nature is trying to understand the world and figure that out. So I want to know just not how to do it, but why I'm doing it this way. And while I'm on my soapbox cleaning up my bench here, I'll just say that science isn't really about right and wrong. It's a process to try and understand the world. What do we know already? How do we know it? And unfortunately, science is often given as a list of facts that are just memorized, and that's just wrong. Those facts may change as we understand the world better. Some things we understand pretty well, you'd be surprised how much we actually don't understand. Like how to seal our wearboards so they don't leak from pottery. Maybe we understand that, I just don't. All right, let me get back to cleaning. All right, the bench is looking almost good as new. Let's see if I can get these things a little bit better. Maybe slightly worse for the wearer. I don't think anyone will notice. If you don't tell, I won't. At some point, I want to fix this surface attachment thingy. I think it was meant for beakers, but all right, back on the shelf. And last is my pour drill. Although this drill has seen better days, it has fallen and cracked the base from the handle more than once, and I've had to super glue it back a couple of times. So far from perfect. Good enough. All right, and there we go. One plaster disaster gone. The only thing left is my floor, and that's gonna have to wait till it's a little bit warmer outside. I'll drag out the mat and then mop everything up. So what are the lessons learned here? Well, I think being doubly sure that the wear boards are attached to the bottom is a good thing. I think in retrospect, I probably should have put this into a bucket. I have a bunch of very thin-walled buckets like this. I think it would be large enough to put the silicone down in. It may not be tall enough. So I might want to go looking around for a few more cheap buckets. I'm just very glad this was plaster, not something else. If it was silicone, it would have been a really big mess. And I can totally empathize with the people that do epoxy pours and spring a leak. That would be a mess. I think that's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the disaster more than I did. And be on the lookout for a new mold for me. We'll see when I get to it. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks.